72 hours. A family of 4 walks into a forest clearing, and 72 hours later, they're stepping through the door of a fully built log cabin. Not a tent, not a shelter made of scrap materials. A real cabin. Insulated walls, a working fireplace, raised wooden floors, a locking door. Somewhere warm to sleep tonight, but the person who built that cabin with his own hands isn't a contractor. He's not running a company. He's a retired logger from Kentucky who decided the system was moving too slow, so he started building faster. The contradiction sits there, impossible to ignore. Across America, homeless people wait an average of 2 years for permanent housing. 24 months of sleeping on concrete, 24 months of rain that soaks through, cold that doesn't end, and the constant fear of what happens when you close your eyes. In Portland, the wait stretches past 3 years. In Los Angeles, it approaches 2.5. Meanwhile, log cabins, the kind that could actually shelter people, keep them warm, give them dignity, are being built in days, not months, not years, days. The gap between what's possible and what's happening isn't a mistake, it's a choice. And the people who decided to stop making that choice are building something the homeless crisis industry isn't prepared to understand. Over the past 4 years, a quiet movement has been spreading across rural America. Arkansas, Tennessee, West Virginia, Kentucky, communities that nobody was paying attention to figured out that you don't need permits that take 2 years to process. You don't need funding committees or city councils or developers who need 20% margins. You need materials that are already there, people who know how to work with their hands, and the willingness to start building before someone tells you that you're allowed. A retired logger named Thomas Hewitt noticed something about the forest behind his property. Trees that fell during storms, timber that would have been cleared anyway, materials that cost nothing except the labor to transform them. He taught himself timber framing using methods so old they're older than American construction codes. Then he started building cabins. The first one took him 8 weeks working alone. The second one, 5 weeks with help. By the time he'd finished his 15th cabin, he was down to 9 days with a volunteer crew. Each one costs between $1,800 and $2,500 to build. Each one can withstand winters that drop below 20 degrees. Each one has a window, a door with a deadbolt, and space enough for a person to remember what privacy feels like. Hi viewers, before we go deeper into this story, I need to ask you something that matters to this entire movement. If you were sleeping outside tonight, would a cabin like this change your life, or would something else matter more to you first? Drop your answer in the comments. The real question isn't whether these cabins work. The real question is why nobody built them sooner. Thomas Hewitt grew up in the mountains where his grandfather taught him that wasted wood was wasted opportunity. The old man built things the way people did before factories existed, before instruction manuals, before the idea that you needed permission to solve a problem took root. 56 years old now. Calloused hands that carry the marks of 40 years working timber. Thomas wasn't famous, wasn't rich, wasn't trying to start a movement. He was just angry. He was angry watching the news. Angry about people he knew from his own town sleeping outside. Angry about the waiting lists that grew longer while meetings got longer. Angry about the gap between the forest behind his house and the family that could be warm instead of cold. The moment that changed everything happened on a Tuesday in October. A man named David came to his door. David was 62, worked construction his entire life until his back gave out, spent the last 18 months sleeping in his truck at a rest stop 20 miles from where he was born. Thomas asked him one question, not about his past, not about what went wrong, just, what would change your life right now? David said, a warm place to sleep that's actually mine. Something shifted that afternoon. Thomas looked at the forest behind his property differently, not as trees, as possibility. He spent that night researching timber framing techniques from the 1700s, techniques that required nothing but skill and hand tools. No power equipment, no blueprints from licensed architects, no permits that took 7 months to process. By the following Saturday, he had materials gathered. By the following Tuesday, David was helping him frame the first cabin walls. 8 weeks later, David wasn't sleeping in his truck anymore. Word travels different in small communities. It moves through churches and diners and the networks of people who actually notice when someone's been outside all winter. Within 6 months, Thomas had built 4 cabins. Within 2 years, he had built 23. Each cabin tells the same story but a different way. Each one is occupied by someone who stopped waiting for the system to catch up. The design itself is deceptively simple. Hand-hewn logs notched at the corners, using techniques called full dovetail joints, methods that lock the structure without nails, without bolts, without anything except gravity and geometry working together exactly right. The walls go up in layers. Each log sits perfectly on the one below it. Insulation comes from the forest itself. Sheep's wool fills the gaps between logs. Breathable, non-toxic. The kind of material that regulates humidity instead of trapping moisture like foam does. A cabin stays naturally warm in ways that modern construction misses entirely because modern construction prioritizes speed over everything else. The roof is hand-split shakes, thick enough to shed water for 30 years without maintenance. Inside, the floors are planed wood that feels substantial under bare feet. A fireplace made from river stone, windows placed to catch morning light, a front porch that creates psychological separation between inside and outside, that moment between the world and your home that actually matters to how your mind processes safety. Total cost remains low because Thomas refuses everything expensive. No contractors, no architects charging consultation fees, no code inspectors looking for violations. Just a retired logger and a growing network of people who learned that you can build shelter faster than bureaucracy moves. Then came the winter test that changed everything about how people understood what was actually possible. The winter of 2023 was brutal. Temperatures across the Appalachian region dropped below 5 degrees for weeks. Record snowfall, the kind of weather that kills homeless people in the cold shelter tent cities. Thomas watched the forecast and felt his stomach tighten. 17 cabins were occupied across the region. 17 people who had made the choice to leave the street. 17 people living in structures that he had built with his own hands. He thought about knocking on doors, checking on everyone, making sure nothing had failed. Then he realized something that caught him completely off guard. They weren't calling him. Nobody was reporting problems. Nobody was complaining about the cold. So he knocked on doors anyway, just to verify they were actually warm. Every single cabin held at the exact temperature it was supposed to. The hand-hewn logs with sheep's wool insulation performed better than the thermodynamics suggested they should. A 70-year-old woman living in the second cabin he'd ever built told him she was sleeping better than she had in 30 years. A man named Robert, who'd spent 15 months in his car before moving into a cabin, described waking up on the coldest morning of the year and realizing his breath wasn't visible. That's when he understood he was truly inside. The cabins worked, not theoretically, actually. But the real revelation came from something nobody expected. The people living in these cabins started building community in ways that traditional homeless services had never achieved. The woman who was sleeping better than she had in 30 years started teaching other residents how to maintain the fireplace. Robert began helping the next person to move into a cabin, understand how to live in the space they'd been given. Informal networks formed. Skills transferred. Hope became contagious in the way it usually isn't. Thomas started receiving calls from other states. Tennessee wanted him to train builders there. West Virginia asked for blueprints. Communities that had been struggling with homelessness for decades saw what was happening and understood something had fundamentally shifted. The thing nobody in the housing industry wants to admit is that the problem was never actually unsolvable. The problem was structural. The problem was that profit margins disappear when you build something in 9 days instead of 9 months. The problem was that traditional solutions required the crisis to continue existing in order to justify their budgets. What Thomas built wasn't just cabins. He built proof. Proof that the gap between needing shelter and receiving it could be closed. Proof that the barriers were political and financial, not technical. Proof that when someone decides to ignore the system that says you have to wait, you don't have to wait. The next video you need to see reveals what's actually happening right now in a warehouse in Kentucky, where builders like Thomas are training the next generation of cabin builders. They're not just creating more shelters. They're creating an entire movement that's spreading through rural America so fast that the housing industry can't keep up. And what they've discovered about how quickly you can scale this, how many people you can help before winter arrives, will shake everything you thought you knew about what's actually possible. That's coming next.